Our first keynote speaker is a man that says of himself, "I have dedicated my life's work and career to advancing artificial intelligence for societal and economic prosperity." He has led R&D of hundreds of AI approaches for a quarter century. Today, he is the Chief AI Officer at TietoEVRY, the leading Nordic digital services company. Please welcome a backbone of the AI community, Christian Guttmann.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here in Berlin and give the introduction talk on the second day at the Rise of AI. Thank you for the organizers to have such an important event here. And my thinking is for this presentation that I will discuss some of those insights that I have gathered over the last almost 20 years working with different businesses around the world. I've worked in 4 continents with many businesses in manufacturing, telecommunications, finance, and so on. And of course, you see a lot of, you gain a lot of knowledge and experience with the CEOs, with the leadership, with the company, with many projects that happen within the organization, and also with the board. So my feeling is, and my ambition with this talk is to really share some of those insights. The talk is also dedicated a little bit towards the leadership, the CEOs, the startup owners, the entrepreneurs, those in organizations that are responsible for scaling AI, for scaling the business of AI. And I think that is a very important topic because, of course, the leadership needs to also understand where the boat is going. And finally, I think before we start off, really, I go into detail on the issue of this duality between new technologies, new disruptive fundamental technologies such as AI, but of course also many related ones like 5G and IoT, and the existing business. So your cash cow, the existing business that some companies have been building up for decades, maybe 50 or 100 years. So, with that started, the talk is really from grassroots to boardrooms. And I would like to start suggesting the question, are all your ducks aligned? I guess most of you are familiar with the saying. It means, well, how ready are you? How prepared are you for this challenge to come? And I would like to discuss about 8 ducks, 8 reflections that I believe are important when you look at the spectrum of these grassroots movements that employees have that start to investigate and execute AI projects, as well as boardrooms, the owners of the company. How do they see the future of the company? It's all about how ready you are. So in this new era of AI, it's really revolutionary questions that are important to reflect on. There will be a smorgasbord of different topics that we will discuss. I believe we have a good amount of time for question and answer, so please feel involved. As mentioned earlier, ask questions. We're very happy to reflect on them. I think we leave plenty of time. And I would also like to say that those 8 topics that are coming, it's very customer-centric and very value-centric. So what type of value propositions can you detect and can you elaborate on? So that is at the core of this entire presentation, really. So let us start. Let us start with the boardroom. So I mentioned grassroots to boardrooms, and as many of you know, the boardrooms and the boards of companies are those that are usually the owners. They're really sitting and steering how the company is moving forward. And the responsibility for boardrooms becomes even bigger in times of massive change, right? So how can you represent the interests of the owners of this company in the best possible way? Choose the right executive team in order to achieve those types of targets and be aware of what the company will become in the future. So then, of course, in those boardrooms, one important aspect is how is that knowledge in the boardrooms around new technologies? Is there an entrepreneurial attitude? Do you have commitments and obligations to owners which have, let's say, a much more dividend focused, or are you able to actually start changing your outlook and perhaps have less and accept to have less revenue for some time in order to gain higher traction and more market lead in the future? So this is a very important part. I have been interacting with many boards, and I understand that the setup of these boards is quite different, that the tasks that they have are quite wide-ranged. In some cases, it's really less risk, and the boardroom members, the board members are having a certain background which is non-digital, non-data, and I would always strongly encourage to actively think about executive or non-executive board members that are entrepreneurs or that know the AI technology very deeply. That's a very important aspect. So that's the boardrooms. Then, of course, again, looking from a CEO perspective, from a leadership perspective, it is so important to cherish the enthusiasm and the entrepreneurship of your employees. I've seen many projects over the last couple of years, maybe 5 to 6 years in European Nordic companies, where you see excellent POCs, proof of concepts, first prototypes, pilots, they go really well, and you see outcomes, but then they often stop. They are buried in the POC cemetery, which is full in Europe, right? So we need less of those short-term projects, but more of these long-term projects. But how do you get there? Well, one aspect is that you as a leader need to understand, you need to connect these grassroots movements, these grassroots projects, and start seeing how they developed, what impact they have on the organization. Study them carefully and understand how you can make a full value change in your organization. So be close to these enthusiastic employees. It's a very precious resource which you would really like to foster and use as good examples across the organization. And then, of course, focus on how you can get those POVs to full scale, end-to-end solutions in your organization. On the other scale, I've also seen a lot, and particularly in Europe, we heard a lot of those discussions yesterday, also from a German perspective, that there's, of course, many employees, also unions, there's a certain angst, the German angst, the fear that, this new technology would essentially introduce challenges into the organization, take away jobs, make life hard and difficult. And of course, that is a topic which is very important. And we have been involved in several projects where you need to focus a lot on building that trust into these AI systems, starting to see that it is not about replacing jobs, but it is about replacing certain tasks which are executed within a certain job, replacing them or augmenting them, and looking from a perspective that it is a combined effort between the human and the AI system in order to really create value. So having augmented value sets. And then, of course, when you're introducing AI for employees to use, they need to trust the outcomes of these systems. And I could give several examples, maybe just two. It is about, we talk to recruitment organizations, and when you are starting to look at scanning resumes and starting to match them to potential job applications or job offers from companies, then of course you want to be very aware that these scans detect and make these types of assessments of what that resume contains in terms of qualities and characteristics is done in a fair and transparent fashion. And at the same time also understand that these job placements, which are today manually assessed, just as the resumes are assessed, are when you're assessing whether they are correct, complete, appropriately written, and so on, that you actually do that also in a fair and complete manner. So a human is still involved, an employee is still involved to assess whether these, or to decide whether these resume assessments are correct and complete, but then you also need to trust the outcomes of these automation and AI systems, right? So that is something that you would really like to highlight. At the same time, you have situations, and we have been increasingly talking to sales departments at organizations, at, for example, manufacturing companies and finance companies, where when you are starting to use AI to predict which customers are more likely to buy your product and services in the future, and you recommend that to your sales force, to your sales representatives, and they are paid based on commission, right? So, and they have their way of being successful in the past, which is perhaps based on manual assessments and discussions they had with customers and so on. But now you have an AI system making recommendations on whom to call. Then, of course, you would like to be very, you need to trust, you need to build that trust. You need to see that you can still achieve the outcomes that you set yourself to achieve by the end of the year. And so these are all new processes that need to be included in these organizations and these sales organizations. So the employees are your driving force in your organization to really transform and adopt this technology. You're the CEO, I mentioned before. The talk is a bit geared towards CEOs, leaders, and entrepreneurs in the organization. So what does that mean? I see a huge interest and curiosity when it comes to this technology as I'm speaking to CEOs and CFOs and CTOs in large organizations and also smaller organizations. And what is, though, let's say, missing is a bit this feeling of what's the art of the possible, right? So it's actually quite hard to assess how your company needs to be restructured, how you will play in quite a different market without having some understanding of what that technology can do. And I really like to give often this nice example, as I have also met a fine colleague in Finland, Risto Silasmaa. I'm sure he would be happy for me to mention him because he is the chairman of Nokia and CEO of F-Secure. Nokia, I guess most of the audience know Nokia, and so he decided to really go back to the bench and learn machine learning and AI. Went to my colleague Andrew Nang to Stanford and actually learn what these algorithms can do, to get a tangible, real feeling of what it does. And so, in fact, as a result of those insights, not only was he able to make a much proper assessment of where the company would be going, but also there was a lot of advice given to governments and other entities in order to learn more about AI. So one result was the Finnish parliament is now learning AI, and that is obligatory, mandatory now in Finland, that everyone in the parliament actually has an understanding of what AI is. Also in part the elements of AI course that comes from Finland, which has now been broadly distributed across the world, is in part related to this initiative. So I can only highly recommend for leadership and executive members to learn more about the technology. So don't let outsiders determine your future. Obviously, you are responsible for the core product and core services that your company is building. I will in fact mention something about this later regarding partnership, but it is very important that you are in the driving seat and you have this knowledge in order to make decisions for your strategy in your company. And then I would actually, from a practical point of view, I would recommend that you hire the best AI people and experts that you can get your hand on, and have as many, place these people next to your desk and have as many coffees with them and lunch breaks as you can possibly have to get a tangible feeling about what is possible in terms of applying AI and data technology and in fact other disruptive technologies that are now on the horizon. So that's a very practical advice, because otherwise it tends to be a discussion topic that's happening at the end of the day or at the end of the week or end of the month, rather than being the core of where you should be focusing in order to re-situate your organization. And you will become much more knowledgeable, insightful, and have much more mature discussions also with the rest of the organization and the board. So, we had a lot of discussions, and of course AI is a lot about the technology and the data. And then, of course, there's a bit of this fear how complex it really is. And I can highlight just the idea that it is true that in some cases, in many cases, the AI that we have today, and one subpart of AI is machine learning, requires a lot of data. So many of you are aware that we talk about supervised learning, for example, neural networks that require a lot of data in order to learn. But that is not the only way how to create value. So you can certainly build AI without having massive amounts of data. So that is worth noting. The AlphaGo success that we had a couple of years ago, in fact, the AI system there was not built on legacy data. The first AlphaGo it was the wisdom of all humans that ever played Go. But the second version that was superior actually learned its moves and its game behavior from the rules of the game. So it was actually not based on a lot of data, and that is worth noting. There are a couple of those examples. Another one is, which holds organizations back, they believe that, we need to look at all the legacy data that we have collected over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And that's certainly not always true either. It was mentioned yesterday when it comes to external data, so the usefulness of external data, adding it to the data that you already have in your system can vastly improve the power of the AI system that you're using for predictive maintenance, let's say, or for many other topics. And secondly, think about creating new data sources. So if you're in a factory and you start making predictions or want to assess anomalies in the factory process, you can install cameras. We heard yesterday a very interesting talk about also how camera data is perhaps one of the biggest sources of AI in terms of data, but you can install them today and collect that data and then use that data in order to do this anomaly detection forward. For that, you do not necessarily need a massive data strategy as to how you handle your legacy systems. So work your way backwards from the value that you want to create, from the value proposition, and see what type of data is necessary in the most minimal case to start off with in order to unleash that value. It is not always necessary to boil the ocean and try to connect all data sources that you have in your organization. Although, of course, in the long run, if you really want to play the long haul, then, of course, it is useful to make a very decent, full-scale investment in order to have all your data connected. Okay, so organizational changes, what I've been seeing a lot, and I think many are familiar with that notion that over the last couple of years, maybe last 4 or 5 years, that's where it started, that businesses have started to build up AI and data teams in organizations, right? So many CEOs and leaders and board members and key employees went over to Silicon Valley and to Shenzhen to get the inspiration, and there was a lot of travel and to see how did the guys in the US and China succeed. Of course, that is not enterprise AI, it is consumer AI, and that era of these types of visits have gone down, but and this first wave that we have experienced in Europe in building AI teams is now also coming to a next level, because there is an understanding and a learning that these pure AI data teams that only consist of data science experts, which you absolutely need, it's very important, but you also need to have those people that understand the business integrated into the rest of the organization, have responsibility to do an end-to-end process implementation in your organization, and also understand what the business impact is to the market. Also have the mandate to actually change the organization, right? So those types of things are now moving into what I would call a second wave, AI maturity, right? So more and more companies start realizing, well, of course we need the data scientists and the AI scientists, and that is very important. But on top of that, we need to give them the more capabilities, business change capabilities, transformational activities, and the mandate to make fundamental changes in the organization. Of course, hand in hand with other stakeholders and with the CEO. But that is very, very important. So I see, in fact, also in the second wave, to be very careful about defragmenting your AI approaches. So I'm looking often at the two extremes which don't work. If you defragment and start distributing the AI initiatives across the organization, and you don't connect them with each other, you have big risks of having parallel agendas which compete. You have big risks in reinventing the wheel. It is not necessary that different service lines and verticals are all reinventing their, for example, AI transparency agendas and algorithms that can be reused across the organization. So you're not This is not recommendable to fully defragment and decentralize your entire AI efforts, right? On the other hand, it is also not advisable to completely centralize your AI approach because you will be needing the insights that reside and exist in the individual business teams, service lines, in the country teams and the verticals, and that knowledge there is of course absolutely important in order to create value propositions around the technology of AI. So be quite mindful about the building an organization that effectively adopts and translates these AI and data science technologies into business impact and value. Yes, I could certainly go on this topic, but maybe we have a chance in the question and answers section. So very important also, which I'm seeing is still a big trouble, let's say it's still a big issue for us here in Europe, is you need to find the AI talent, and how do you keep and retain that talent, right? So it is still so that for a big implementation of a big change and big business impact in your organization, you still need kick-ass talent. You need the best of the best in your organization in order to really make a change. So there is a huge competition in finding that talent, attracting that talent. Europe overall is a netto exporter of AI talent to the Valley, to the US, to many parts of the world. And it is a matter of how to attract and also retain that talent, right? How can we keep that talent in Europe? Many of our fellow areas and countries, innovation countries like Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, we had a big discussions around moonshot projects, projects that really make a difference and move the needle. That is attracting top talent in the world, right? So there's many examples in the US, and that is certainly one attracting point. And you will be competing, if you're a European company and a European CEO and a European entrepreneur, let's say, and a leader, you're competing with those companies in the US, in China. So you need to be quite innovative as to what you bring to the table to this talent in order to really keep them here. Yes. And of course, highlighting something that I often say, but I think it is still very clear and obvious that talent is still scarce. And to put it in numbers, WEF, New York Times, Wired have estimated the global talent pool of real leaders that can move the needle at about 10,000 experts in the world. Right? So in the Nordic countries, I often break that down statistically, that means we have about 5 in Sweden, 3 in Finland, and about 3 in Norway, right? That is what you are mapping it down to. So there is a big challenge in having this type of talent and keeping that talent. And as I mentioned earlier, we are netto exporters, so it's actually less than those numbers that we're actually having. Right? And this is not, of course, many experts and talents that have learned how machine learning works and how you can apply it, but also starting to see the bigger picture, business, having a business understanding, working with governments, seeing the regulatory frameworks, and how you're actually creating an ecosystem around the technology. And then, of course, it is more and more, let's say, it is an increased trend that you as an organization, if you're a manufacturer or a finance organization or a recruitment agency or you work in tourism, that you need to find a qualified partner. A partner that you can rely on, and it is a partner where you will see that you can speed up your innovation, that you can speed up the adoption of AI. But I've seen many unfortunate cases where you, due to the early days of this technology and less knowledge as to how this actually translates, that partner choices have been suboptimal. Let's put it this way. And one advice that I give here is, as you're evaluating your partner, look closely as to what talent they really have on their side. Whom have they employed in order to make this partnership happening? And it is then not enough just to have someone that is a technological knowledgeable figure, so having, let's say, a PhD and many years of scientific experience in this field, but you also need someone that has a very deep business insight. So how do you translate this technology into business environments? What is the impact that is in this organization? Does this person have an entrepreneurial background, for example? How much business has been translated? So you need someone that understands the mathematics, the algorithms in depth, and that same person, I say that clearly, you don't need two separate persons at this point. You need the same person that has the ability to also understand the business impact, and ideally also one that understands the regulatory environment and the government environment, let's say the state environment in which you are performing those AI projects and how you're turning into more AI first company. Yeah, finally, I mean, I will reflect briefly and then we can probably take it to the Q&A session. Is now we start becoming ready towards building a roadmap and a strategy for AI, putting it all together. I mentioned earlier that having a full strategy of AI considers some of the aspects I mentioned before, and there's so many more aspects that I couldn't discuss in this talk, but please reach out to ask more questions. I'm thinking, of course, of value propositions. How do you technology, no one sells AI, right? You're selling the impact and the business and the value to the organization. You need to be pretty clear as a company, as the owner of the company and as the CEO of the company, in which market you want to compete in 2 or 3 years' time. Where have you found your niche? How do you want to change your organization? And what capabilities do you need to successfully arrive there? Choosing the partners, attracting the talent, and knowing what type of products and services you're going to offer to the market. That is the comment on strategy, and this is pretty much the last slide, summarizing all the different ducks, the different reflections that I've shared with you, and I leave this last slide where it is, and I'm looking forward to many great questions and a good dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. We already have one question from the audience. I want to encourage you to ask more. So the other Daniel, welcome back, asked the question, yesterday it was shown that corporates usually don't have entrepreneurs or an innovation-focused role in company leadership. In your experience, is there a different development on how that innovation is evolving in those companies?
Yes, I mean, you can say that we will see in the short and midterm that the companies that are applying AI and have a certain risk appetite when it comes to these new disruptive technologies will be different to those that don't, right? So of course, there's always a higher risk doing new things, but the chances for you to prevail in this market is of course higher. And I think this is of course not necessarily empirically completely studied, although I'm sure there is actually a lot of evidence, and I think I've read a couple of research papers on that. But if you have a more entrepreneurial board team and leadership team, you're starting to consider your business in quite a different way. You're starting to look at opportunities. But if your leadership team and board team consists a lot of, let's say, those that understand how standard business, the mature business is executed, which is very important. Like when you bring your startup organization, as Hans pointed out yesterday, to scale stage and it becomes mature, you need people that execute. You need transactional leaders. You don't need transformational leaders. You need people that just execute. And those tend to be in the boardrooms of the established businesses today. Right, so yes, when it comes to revolutionary and new transformational technologies as AI is, you will almost certainly benefit from having an executive or non-executive board member that is an entrepreneur, or ideally several. So I see the tendency. We will, of course, with AI, we're still sort of in the beginning of that in the enterprise domain, but over the years, I'm almost certain that you will find that companies that have 2 or 3 entrepreneurs that are rocking the boat, that are saying, hey, we need to do it differently, will have a much better chance of prevailing.
That's very interesting. And last time I checked, most of the board members and CxOs were human. And since humans always have to deal with feelings like fear and maybe rivalry, what's going on when there are suddenly a lot of, I would say, new people on the playground that do things differently, are maybe admired. Now, these are the new guys we got in to do the great new wonderful thing of AI. What happens from a human perspective? How are the dynamics?
Yeah, exactly. It's true. I mean, people are, how to say, some feel comfortable in really looking at the cash cows of the organization and optimizing those, right? And that brings a lot of comfort. And as you're introducing variables of uncertainty, you will start seeing people, getting a bit nervous on the seats. Yes. So if your question is how do you deal with fear, I mean, I remember, and I think it is still partly let's say, a method in boardrooms and leadership teams, that you are taking out your leadership team to particular events, right? To really stretch them, to make them feel fear, right? To make it part, like, no, I exaggerate, but I know one example where they pretty much just went with a helicopter on a mountain and pretty much pushed them out of the helicopter skiing down, right? So it's you need to be experiencing this feeling of there is many uncertain environments. You need to take a chance, and things will be good at the other end. So I think this is a very important exercise.
Right. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the proof of concept graveyard, you call it, I think. And that's a picture that just doesn't fade even after your talk. So why do you think there are so many proofs of concept in the graveyard? Because the idea, of course, is you have a proof of concept, right? Then you explore the market, and if the market is there for it, you immediately go for it, and this doesn't seem to happen. Is that another fear thing, or what is it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors. So first, what my team is doing, and what I'm often encouraging, and also encourage the customers in the ecosystem to think not of proof of concepts, but a proof of values. So that when you're engaging and you're doing a particular project and you're investigating whether this technology makes a difference, then don't just focus on it being, is it technologically feasible, which is important, but also does it create value? So measure the outcome, define the KPIs, what difference does it make to the organization from a business perspective? Does it reduce costs? Does it increase revenue? What difference does it make to the operational model? So keep a lot of focus on that. I've seen so many projects where the first thought is, we do POC, because everyone knows what a POC is, and that is sort of the end of that part. The second variable is it's often a bit of an easy choice, right? Because you say, look, I put a few million on the side, I give them for some people to play with. I mentioned earlier the employees, the enthusiastic employees that think, luckily they get the few million and they can play and they can show.
It's a wellness program or appreciation program for employees.
Almost, yes. Yeah. So I'm exaggerating, of course, a bit, but then they get those millions, but there's really no follow-up plan, And it is also worth noting that even if you show this POV at the end, right? You need to scale and deploy it. So let's say it works for 2 shops in an organization. Well, how do you scale it to 10,000 shops, right? Across Europe, if that's and that requires much more investment. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Connect the grassroots movements to the boardroom, because they need to understand, this POV has worked. Now these guys need 50 million euro, maybe 100 million euro in order to scale that. Where is that coming from? Even the CEO cannot just take it out of his pocket and say, here it is.
This probably has to do with the other idea you introduced, like the art of the possible. Not only possible to get the product, to make the product, but to get it out and to roll it out maybe globally or Europe-wide, right? This should be probably considered early.
And you could argue that, the scaling and deploying, that's almost a bit more standard in some sense, because you need to, at least on one level, because you need to start thinking about, well, what type of business logistics do you need to consider? What type of processes in the big process map do you need to change, and so on? What business processes will be impacted? But, there is analysis and methods for that. Then, of course, AI comes with different challenges.
Right. Do you see a problem there together with the idea of the war of talents? Of course, you want to recruit incredibly talented people, and maybe you get them, and they have these great proof of concept, but they're never put out into the real world, and then they might just as well leave and go to Apple or Google or wherever they're going. Is that a phenomenon that you see, or a danger that you see?
Yes, of course. And I would even say, now I want to be a bit careful, but because I have a lot of colleagues and friends that also work at the big American organizations, right?
Right.
At Google, Facebook, and many others. But I think it is fair to state that when it comes to the maturity and the exposure of that talent, and now we speak data, people that know the algorithms fantastically well, they can sometimes be a little bit spoiled because the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons have so much money. They're reinvesting that money right now, and the business value, the business outcomes are not always the highest priority.
Right.
So you can very easily create 200, 300 people project, right, with top researchers and top scientists, where the outcome is not critical to the organization. That is not a luxury that many European companies have, and I would almost say that as we are succeeding here, we become much more, how to say, battle-proven, right? Because I would still say that, the 20, 30, 40 people that we have in big organizations in Europe that are leading these initiatives need to think more about this business impact, and I think they are more prepared in this enterprise AI era forward to really be, let's say, more competitive.
Right.
So,
I would like to talk about one aspect that you briefly mentioned, almost as a tangent. You said drink a lot of coffee.
Yeah.
And of course, I know you live in you live in Stockholm. I know that in Sweden there is this fika tradition, like drinking hour-long coffees in the morning, in the afternoon, with everybody in the company, which to Germans is a nightmare. Like so much productivity, right, left at the coffee table. And you talked about your Finnish friend who just said, I'm going to learn something, although he's running a company. I mean, a luxury probably many CEOs in Germany would take for a day, but not for a month or a couple of weeks a year. Do you see a different mentality there? Is there something we can learn from the Nordic countries?
Yeah, I think everyone, and I'm looking even at myself as a person, I've been living in many places in the world, and I tend to think, and I hope that I'm sort of picking certain positive aspects and characteristics from certain cultures, right, to collect it together. And yes, I think there's something to be learned from the Nordics. I think one aspect, and that's also one that TietoEVRY as a company and the Nordic AI Institute put very boldly on the map, is that we have a lot of respect for the individual, and we have a lot of respect. We really consider there's very little hierarchy. Right. And I would say in part it encourages
not only a nominally flat hierarchy, but a really flat hierarchy. That's
very
what you mean?
quite. Yeah. You can call our CEO almost any time, and then have discussions. And he's very engaged. Just to take one example, but I think you find that in many Nordic companies. So I think, and then the fika culture is, I think I would say, is particularly strong in Sweden, right? The Finns are not. They also drink a lot a lot of coffee, actually more. I think than
drink other things, right?
They drink. Yes. I don't know. Yeah. But of course, look. I mean, there is benefit in having meetings, which we now have much less due to Corona, of course. And it depends probably a little bit what the nature of these meetings are. Specifically to the CEO, I mean, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek comment, right? You don't have to obviously sit all the time and have coffee, but sit close to the people that know this technology. And at least me and some of the people that I know, the curiosity sparks these interests and saying, hey, what here's a business problem that I'm seeing all the time. I cannot predict why is the sales unit in the Netherlands not performing well, right? And so the AI person, the experts on the side can, this is not very, very tangible, but can certainly give you insights as to what's possible and what isn't. They say, well, can't we just take all the data and then make a prediction? They give you a bit of an assessment. I think that is a good sparring session, a good session of you getting deeper inside, hands-on.
Right. So thank you very much for your insights. I will have a coffee with you any day you want. Thank
Fantastic.
you. Christian Guttmann.
Welcome.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.